So I couldn't really make it through a discussion of flowering plant origins without mentioning the fact that Charles Darwin once referred to this issue himself as an abominable mystery. It's here in this letter that he wrote to his friend Joseph Hooker in 1879. He writes, "The rapid development, as far as we can judge, of all higher plants within recent geological times is an abominable mystery." By higher plants, Darwin was talking about angiosperms, and by recent geological times, he's referring to the findings of flowering plants that started in the Middle Cretaceous, which is recent when compared to the bulk of the fossil record that goes back over 5 times farther into the past. I want to talk a little bit about what it was about angiosperm origins that was so vexing for Darwin, and how this is a little different from why a modern botanist might still be mystified by the origin of flowering plants. Keep in mind that this was a period in which Darwin was being continually attacked by creationists among his contemporaries. He had many opponents, largely forgotten now except for in history books, who built their careers around attempts to demonstrate any kind of debilitating weakness in Darwin's model of evolution by natural selection. Saint-Georges Mivart, for example, had engaged Darwin in a debate regarding the origin of flatfish, like flounders and halibut. Mivart's claim was that flatfish could not have evolved from normal fish because the evolutionary change could not have occurred in a gradual sequence. There would be no advantage to having one eye move only partway up the head and the blind side of the fish. Arguments like Mivart's were actually extremely productive for Darwin and for the whole of evolutionary biology because they brought good questions to the table, questions that would need to be resolved, if not by Darwin, then by generations of evolutionary biologists to come later. In this letter to Hooker, Darwin was anticipating that the sudden appearance of angiosperms would be a strong card that could be played by his creationist challengers. One of the tenets of Darwin's model was that evolutionary change occurred gradually with the accumulation of tiny changes over thousands of generations. However, looking at the fossils, it seemed that, despite a much longer history of other kinds of plants, the flowering plants went from no fossils in the early Cretaceous to nearly full-blown diversity by the mid-Cretaceous. There was no gradual development or slow building up from primitive early proto-daisies. Instead, it seemed like this evolutionary explosion of modern plants took place in the geologic equivalent of the wink of an eye. Darwin realized that this interpretation of the plant fossil record could be adopted by his creationist opponents, who would see this as a major failure for Darwin's model of gradual transmutation of species. Darwin's words here are betraying a deep discomfort. I know it might not sound like much today, but for a Victorian gentleman, calling angiosperm evolution an abominable mystery, even in private communication, shows that he was deeply dissatisfied with his ignorance on the matter. There are 2 things to note here. First, while the Cretaceous angiosperm fossils did play into the hands of Darwin's creationist opponents, it's not like they are offering positive support for the story told in Genesis. It would have been more like Mivart's flatfish challenge, an observation that didn't conform with no naturalistic explanation, which is not doing anything to support a supernatural explanation, although this is exactly what the creationists wanted. Regardless of how quickly it was that plants diversified, the fossils would still have to be vastly older than a few thousand years, which is all that the Bible would really allow. And so even in Darwin's time, creationists really needed to abandon the literalist young Earth ideas that are somehow still being championed by some very simple-minded people in the 21st century. The second thing is that it's interesting to note how if you, for example, were to turn out to become a figure of great historical importance, every one of your private emails, texts, and even your cell phone conversations could be dug up later by your biographers and scrutinized for any kind of significant insight as to the person you are today. Okay, so now in the light of what we've learned in the past century and a half since Darwin declared this mystery as abominable, the question of plausibility of such a rapid rise by angiosperms is really a non-issue. It is plausible, and for a lot of reasons. One of the things that Darwin could not have known is the true scale of the Earth's history. It was much older than a few thousand years, of course, but how much older? William Thomson, also known as Lord Kelvin, was easily the most famous scientist of his day, estimated the age of the Earth initially at 100 million years, and he later reduced that estimate to only 20 million years. Even if you take the longer of these two and allow for some margin of error around Kelvin's well-argued calculations, this would still mean that the Cretaceous period as a whole would be at most a few million years, and the Angiosperms would thus have to be undergoing an impossibly fast diversification within a very narrow window near the mid-Cretaceous. Now, Darwin and Lord Kelvin lacked a lot of information that we have today, as well as some important tools like potassium-argon dating. The Cretaceous lasted from 145 million to 65 million years ago, and that narrow window for the explosive angiosperm radiation actually spans a period from around 115 to 100 million years ago. That's still a narrow window compared to the Cretaceous as a whole, but it still gives us 15 million years, and this is undoubtedly a whole lot longer than what Darwin could have thought realistic. So what I have here is a representation from Wikipedia of the Cretaceous. And it starts down here in the Jurassic, and the Jurassic is 145 million years ago. And it goes Cretaceous, 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 all the way up to the end of the Mesozoic, start of the Paleogene, 65.5 million years ago. And we divide the Cretaceous into the late parts and the early parts. We've got these subdivisions. The Berriasian to the Albian correspond to the early Cretaceous, and the Cenomanian subdivision all the way to the Maastrichtian correspond to the late Cretaceous. And don't worry about memorizing these names. I might be making some reference to them as we talk about the different times within the Cretaceous, that's all. So when we talk about the angiosperm radiation, we're really talking about a period kind of like towards the end of the Aptian through the Albian. And that's the time in which we have so many angiosperm fossils coming to light. But they're fossils that come before that time. And one of the kinds of fossils that we have is from the palynological record. Pollen grains that are clearly fossils of angiosperms are evident from the Valanginian. And we've got some other fossils that are megafossils of angiosperms that's bigger than a pollen grain that we're seeing from earlier than 115 million years ago. But all in all, the findings of these earlier fossils of angiosperms really doesn't change much as far as Darwin's dilemma is concerned. If anything, the rarity, the scarcity of these fossils from the early Cretaceous is simply confirming the idea that there really was a very, very rapid diversification taking place here in the Middle Cretaceous. But this brings me to the next bit of knowledge that we have today that Darwin didn't have in his time, and it has to deal with the actual tempo of evolutionary change. Darwin thought that evolutionary change occurred in a steady and gradual way, whereas now we view evolutionary change as occurring in relatively sudden bursts, typically in response to changes in the environment. Now, if you're interested, you can Google punctuated equilibrium, or you can even look it up in your biology text. I'm sure it's there. There was an interesting debate going on in the late 1900s, 1980, 1990, and that's kind of getting at a different story. It's kind of like talking about the way in which organisms change over time. What we're talking about here is the speed with which a taxon grows from a small number of ancestral species into many, many descendant species. And this is also variable over time. The fossil record demonstrates for us that species diversification over time is pulsed, occurring in fits and starts. We also have variation across taxa. Some taxa will grow incredibly rapidly during the same period of time, while closely related taxa stay at a relatively small size. Sometimes just a few species, or maybe even just a single species that stays there in the smaller taxa. We see this in animals, and we're seeing the same pattern in plants. What causes a taxon like the Angiospermi to just go nuts in an explosion of new species diversification? That's a big question, but it's not insurmountable. We have a reasonably good understanding of several causes and mechanisms that can account for rapid speciation, and we're definitely going to be talking about these more as we look more carefully at the angiosperms. So what I'm telling you here is that Darwin's abominable mystery is no big deal in the light of our state of knowledge in the 21st century. However, there are still big mysteries surrounding the origin of angiosperms, things that are as maddening to modern botanists as the rapid diversification was to Darwin. The most notable of these mysteries is that complete disappearance from the fossil record of the flowering plant lineage for that 180 million year period between the time when they split away from the rest of the seed plants and the beginning of the angiosperm radiation. We have so many fossils, so many good plant fossils from this entire period, and yet none of them stands out as being a good candidate for a sister taxon to the angiosperms. Darwin was never really concerned with this, or maybe never even aware of it, that there was this huge gap in the fossil record, when he referred to the angiosperm origins as this abominable mystery. But because Darwin was who he was, people will still tend to give him credit for pointing out this and every other little difficulty that we find in our attempts to understand the origin of flowering plants. To give you another view of this modern-day abominable mystery, let's take the seed plant tree and extend the 5 lineages that roughly depicts the chronology of these events. The 4 gymnosperm taxa are established very early, and putting the geologic time periods on now, we're showing the radiation is happening sometime in the Carboniferous. Now this 5th lineage, the one that eventually gives us flowering plants, is MIA for this whole time until the Cretaceous, but then it sort of explodes into an enormous array of plant diversity, which is what we still see today. The part that was Darwin's mystery was the explosion of the flowering plants, whereas our biggest mystery is the disappearance of all traces of the ancestors. Let's start with defining the key characteristics of flowering plants. There are a few important ones, but the most obvious synapomorphy of flowering plants would be the flower, of course, which is distinct from the cone structure found in gymnosperms in a couple of key ways. One feature of the angiosperm's flower is that the megagametophytes, or ovules, are enveloped within one or more carpels that fuse into an ovary, which is part of the flower's pistil. The carpel derives from the megasporophyll, and it bears a structure which is sort of like the cupule that we talked about before. It contains the megagametophyte. What I've drawn here is a megasporophyll. And sort of what I want you to envision is that this megasporophyll is going to wrap over the megagametophyte, kind of like a tortilla closing in over the carne asada in a taco, and it's going to fuse right there in the middle to create an enclosed megagametophyte. Okay? The megagametophyte is inside of a vessel, which is where the term angiosperm comes from. So let's see how that works. Megasporophyll closes, and we end up with an enclosed megagametophyte. Now, gymnosperms, of course, have an integument surrounding the ovule, but the cupule never gets wrapped up, and so the seed is always naked, which is where the term gymnosperm comes from. Gymno means naked, sperm is seed, in contrast to the angiosperm, in which the seed is always encased inside of this vessel. Okay, another thing is that there are 2 layers of integument surrounding the flowering plant's ovules. Whoops, you can sort of read that. That is, the ovules are bitegmic, in contrast to the single integumentary layer seen in gymnosperms. In angiosperms, the enveloping tissues of carpel and integument give rise to the fruit that encases the seed. Sometimes the fruit is fleshy and attractive to animals, like this yellow plum, and sometimes the fruit is dry. Dry fruit often have structural parts that allow them to disperse their seeds without getting eaten by animals. Maybe it's a little parachute that will allow them to travel by the wind, like a dandelion, or maybe it has hooks that attach to the fur on passing animals. All of these external coverings of the seed can usually be traced to either or both carpel or integument. Some people, maybe your textbook is guilty of this as well, will tell you that having fruit is another one of the synapomorphies of angiosperms. But then thinking about it more, you start to realize that whether or not this is really true is more of a semantic game than it is good biology. You probably don't consider the little umbrella structure on a dandelion seed to be part of a fruit, even though from the standpoint of botanical anatomy, it certainly is a fruit. On the other hand, some gymnosperms produce things that are considerably more fruit-like than dandelions. Yew trees, like what we're looking at here, produce a bright red, sweet berry. Ginkgos, if you remember, produce those sour-smelling cherries from hell. Netum, Podocarpus, and cycads also produce fleshy, fruit-like structures, all of which get disqualified as true fruit because the fleshy parts of those things, that is, the parts that will be attractive to some animal, derives from integument rather than carpel. This may be significant for students who are looking to gain an understanding of good botanical anatomy, but it's also confusing for everyone else. The pollen of angiosperms is also characteristic in having a hollow outermost shell. The exene is a layer of pollen coat that's in the very outside part of the pollen grain, and it has an open space in between a floor and a roof. The roof, or tectum, is supported by columns or columella, and this is where the name tectate columellate pollen comes from. Having this hollow air-filled space surrounding the entire pollen grain is obviously a good idea when you consider that it's a pollen job to carry the sperm through the air, either by wind or on the body of some kind of pollinator, usually some type of bug. A lightweight structure is obviously going to make sense. And by the way, most wind-pollinated gymnosperms also produce lightweight pollen, but their pollen grains are attached to large air sacs. We call that saccate pollen, rather than having air-filled voids in the outer layer. Tectate columellate pollen is actually a very good synapomorphy for angiosperms, and we can use this feature to recognize angiosperm pollen in palynological studies. Next, it's also generally pretty easy to recognize an angiosperm if you can look at the vascular tissue. And like the pollen, this also requires a microscope. The xylem of flowering plants usually has vessel elements, a cellular structure that's simply absent in all non-gymnosperms, as well as one very peculiar angiosperm. The xylem of gymnosperms consists entirely of tracheids, which are very different in appearance from these vessel elements. We're seeing them over here. Now, if you're in a lab class, there's a standard and fun laboratory exercise, which is to distinguish between hardwood, that is any wood coming from a flowering plant, and softwood, which is almost always going to be from some type of gymnosperm. If you see only tracheids, then it's a softwood. If you see vessel elements, then it's a hardwood. The leaves of angiosperms are also pretty characteristic. They tend to be flat and blade-like, in contrast with either needle-like conifer leaves or the very characteristic ginkgo leaves or fern fronds or cycad fronds. Leaves are pretty good for leaving fossils because they're relatively durable, and they're also produced in such abundance. There's a pretty good chance that if you produce 1 billion leaves, some of them are going to get fossilized. Now, one nice thing about leaves is that they're pretty diagnostic of the paleoclimate because of the way that leaf shape and size evolves in predictable directions under conditions of drought versus abundant water and low versus high levels of light. It's true that our estimates of angiosperm diversity through the majority of their fossil record is based on leaf morphology alone. Finally, there's a telltale organic chemical signature left behind by angiosperms, which allows you to detect angiosperm residue even if there's no good fossil. Or if there's a fossil of uncertain identity, the presence of this chemical signature, oleanine, can confirm that it's an angiosperm as opposed to something else. Oh, and there's actually one more microfossil that I want to throw in the mix. Phytoliths are microscopic structures made of silica that plants incorporate into their leaves and tissues. Being what they are, tiny, tiny rocks produced in huge abundance, these things fossilize fabulously, and there's a pretty good descriptive database that would allow you to identify what kind of plant that a phytolith came from. For example, here we're looking at phytoliths of a particular kind of ginger along the top. On the left, you've got a phytolith that was collected from a modern plant, and on the right, you're looking at the fossil phytolith that's been tentatively identified as belonging to the same taxon that we see on the left. It turns out that many flowering plant families can be recognized from phytolith morphology alone, that is, without any pollen or megafossils. The earliest hints of angiosperm existence comes in the form of the microfossils, pollen and phytoliths, or chemical fossils like oleanine. And even using these tools, we get nothing more than a few vague, some might say dubious, hints of pre-Cretaceous existences of angiosperms. Quite recently, I think it was in 2004, a fossil of an ancient water lily, Arca fructus was its name, was discovered in China, and the first report had this fossil placed in the late Jurassic. Now, this fossil site in China was unusual in lacking lava flows or any other material that would allow for a clear dating of the rock. And later on, with further analysis, it turned out to be more likely early Cretaceous, not nearly as old as the first report, but even so, it's still the oldest Angiosperm megafossil. Fossil Angiosperm pollen is there in a very limited scope in the Valanginian, and it started to form a continuous record in the Barremian around the time of the poorly dated Archifructus fossil. Bottom line here is that the current state of fossil evidence doesn't substantively change the suddenness of angiosperm diversification from the way that Darwin saw it when he called it an abominable mystery. They really did appear to rise to diversity and rise to dominance in a relatively short expanse of time, which I said before is still 15 million or more years. In the next lesson, we'll talk about the picture of early angiosperms that's developed from our growing understanding of paleoclimate, as well as reconstruction based on fossils as well as the most basal of extant flowering plants. To summarize what we've talked about here, we started with history, the words penned by Charles Darwin as he was expressing his bewilderment about the rapid rise of angiosperms in recent times, which for Darwin probably meant something rather different in scale and scope from the way we view early to middle Cretaceous today. We also ran through the general characteristics of angiosperms and a little bit about the earliest record for the group based on the fossils bearing these angiosperm synapomorphies.